Of all games, gambling is the one that should be approached with the greatest caution. One can lose their head, risk everything, and lose. This often leads to a bad outcome. David was indeed addicted to gambling, but was this the real reason behind the tragedy that unfolded? David Nixon was a good-natured, ambitious, and positive person. He lived in the small town of Grapevine, Texas, USA. The man was in the business world and could sell anything to anyone. His first wife, Donna Lella, spoke only positively about him. They married in 1990, and a year later, the couple had a son. David began dealing in real estate, and it turned out to be a very promising profession for someone of his intellect. Gradually, he became the leading broker in town, closing deals worth millions of dollars. He enjoyed working with luxury estates in the wealthy suburbs north of Dallas the most. Their marriage broke down in 1995 after David had an affair with flight attendant Lisa Hill. However, he maintained a good relationship with his first wife, mainly because of their shared son, Nicholas. David married a new woman, but they divorced 2 years later. The man didn't stay single for long. Even before his divorce from Lisa was finalized, he met another woman, an attractive 27-year-old named Tracy Frame, who worked as an accountant. Tracy described David as charming and a very nice person to get along with. He met her at a time when Tracy had little interest in dating and relationships. The young woman ignored her admirer's advances for a long time, but he was very persistent, so she agreed to a date with him. After that, they began to build a romantic relationship. Soon, the couple moved into David's house to live together. Thus, David's probable third wife moved to Grapevine. Those close to him described the man as a great lover of exquisite and beautiful things, which he possessed in abundance. The desire for luxury goods, which sometimes didn't match his income, became a characteristic trait of David. Tracy didn't really care about his problems either, as the realtor always managed to get out of any unpleasant situation and continue living a social life. At the time of the events described, David's son was 11 years old. He simply idolized his father. According to the boy, David was reliable and never refused to help those close to him. The man communicated regularly with his son, took him out on weekends and during holidays, which helped them develop a strong bond. David was in the prime of his life when he suddenly became the victim of a tragic murder. But could his extravagant lifestyle, his risk-taking nature, and his financial troubles have been the reason for the incident? On April 18, 2002, a passerby noticed a fire late in the evening and called the fire department. When the firefighters managed to extinguish the blaze, they made a suspicious discovery, presumably a human body wrapped in something. The firefighters then alerted the police. In the middle of the night, an investigator from the local police department was called to the scene. It was David Nixon's new house in Grand Prairie, Texas, where the man had recently moved before the tragic event. The officer later recalled that he smelled the foul odor of burnt and charred flesh as he stepped out of his car in the driveway in front of the house. He discovered the body wrapped in multiple layers of fabric that were not completely burned. It was later found to be an electric blanket, a sturdy camping tarp, and a rope that held everything together. The investigator examined the body, which was in a terrible condition. He couldn't even definitively tell whether it was a man or a woman. However, based on the preserved facial features, the officer determined that the deceased was a fair-skinned man. The police officer called for backup, as handling the charred corpse delicately was impossible to do alone. It took several hours before the body could be carefully removed from the scene. During the on-site investigation, tire tracks and some fibrous materials were found that might have been used to start the fire. These were later identified as electric blankets. However, no other usable evidence was found to identify the suspect. The coroner conducted an analysis and determined that the deceased was a man in his early 40s who was killed by a single shot to the heart area. He was already dead before the fire started, making it a case of homicide. There were no signs of a struggle, so the experts assumed that the immediate death by a bullet surprised the victim, possibly while he was sleeping. During the first autopsy, the victim could not be identified, although investigators were confident that the deceased was the homeowner. Dental records were needed to identify the person. Based on these records, it was confirmed that the murdered man was indeed the 40-year-old realtor and gambling addict David Nixon. This event was a severe blow to the family of the deceased, especially to his son Nicholas. That day, the boy was supposed to call his father, but he got no answer. The teenager felt that something terrible might have happened, but he didn't know that his father was already dead at that time. From the beginning, police officers suspected that the victim's roommate might be the murderer. The couple's acquaintances said that they generally got along well, but there were occasional serious arguments about David's finances and gambling debts. In such moments, the situation would escalate, and everyone nearby would try to get away. The longer this tumultuous relationship lasted, the more Tracy accused her boyfriend of spending exorbitant amounts on gambling. He argued that it was none of her business. Their differences became more apparent in the spring of 2002, and after almost 4 years of being together, the couple decided to separate. However, this threatened to lead to a serious legal dispute due to tax issues, and out of fear of losing the house, David transferred it to Tracy to protect his property. When the issue of separation came up, Tracy wanted to keep the rights to David's fancy house with its covered terrace and heated pool. The man tried to resolve the matter with her and reclaim his property, but she refused to agree. On April 10th, the situation almost got out of control when David called the police to report that Tracy had changed the locks on his house without his knowledge. She had taken advantage of his absence when the realtor went on a business trip to a neighboring town. The police were able to mediate the dispute that same evening. After that, the two sat down, according to their statements, to negotiate a solution that would be favorable to both. Tracy claimed she had invested her own money in the renovation of the house, which is why she insisted she had the right to keep it. However, she couldn't prove the investment, and it was impossible to come to an agreement with her ex. Almost 2 weeks later, David was found murdered. All of this naturally appeared suspicious since the man had no other conflicts with anyone else. It seemed quite likely that Tracy was involved in getting rid of her partner to keep the house. Moreover, it is usually the people closest to the victim who are involved in the murder. Tracy cooperated with the investigators. She wondered who could have killed David, but the victim's first wife had no doubts. On the very night she learned about her ex-husband's death, Donna went to the police station. She said that her ex-husband had recently feared for his life because of Tracy's inappropriate behavior. She handed over to the police his last will, as he had asked her to give them the name of his murderer should something happen to him. It was Tracy Frame. The man himself had never contacted the police when he faced domestic violence and downplayed the problems. But Donna knew everything and realized that David was in a dangerous situation when it came to the division of property. He had always tried to find an amicable solution to the dispute, but it seemed that his partner was provoking more conflicts. Donna called the police to her ex-husband's house when she learned that their son could not reach his father. Previously, she had called Tracy and tried to find out what might have happened, but Tracy brushed it off and said that she hadn't been keeping an eye on her ex-boyfriend, from whom she had already separated. In her opinion, he could be anywhere, perhaps drinking or gambling. She said that David had been hanging out with a group of friends during these days and was moving to a new house, which is why he had to stay in a hotel. According to her, he always traveled to Las Vegas over the weekends. This city became another possible destination for the search. Tracy assured Donna that he usually gambled and partied with call girls during this time. Despite the split, the couple, according to Tracy, still lived together for a while in the contested house in Grapevine. However, they had agreed that the man would soon move out. Just a few days before David was found dead, he was supposed to pack his things and move into a new house in Grand Prairie. According to Tracy's statement, the former lovers had discussed the moving plans. David had asked her to rent a moving truck to transport his belongings. She didn't let him down and called Penske to rent a special truck and a dolly to help load the items onto the truck. In the afternoon, David packed up his things and drove to his new address. Then, he intended to return to pick up the rest, but David never came back. Naturally, Tracy became a key witness for the investigators. Moreover, the resulting disagreement provided a strong motive for the crime. From the beginning, the investigators paid close attention to her, as it seemed that the young woman was the perfect candidate for the role of a suspect. During the first interrogation, when Tracy learned that David had been murdered, the investigators expected to see a grieving woman who needed comfort after the loss of a loved one, as is usually the case. However, her reaction was completely different from what the police had anticipated. She immediately asked how the body had been identified. The officers were troubled by this strange question. Later, however, Tracy emphasized that she had never asked such a question. The first meeting with the victim's girlfriend only heightened their suspicion of her. From that moment on, the investigators began to verify their assumptions. According to Tracy, they had a serious disagreement a few months before the man's death. With tears in her eyes, she said that she had lost a child the night before all of these events occurred, which only made the situation worse. It turned out that Tracy found out she was pregnant last fall. David was the father. This coincided with the moment when the couple's relationship began to fall apart. Additionally, her health problems were becoming apparent. For these reasons, the woman began to experience emotional difficulties. She realized it was not the right time to have a child and decided to terminate the pregnancy. Despite her own decision, she blamed David for the loss of the child, which presented a new motive. The woman expected a different reaction from her lover, support, but it turned out that he was indifferent to the situation. She claimed that instead of sympathy and support, she only received sarcastic comments. After hearing this, Tracy finally realized that she didn't want to be with such an insensitive and cruel man. It is noteworthy that the investigators couldn't find any evidence of Tracy's pregnancy, let alone any evidence of David's reaction. Everything was recorded solely based on her statements. The investigators closely observed the primary suspect during the initial interrogation. Afterward, every officer was unanimously convinced that Tracy was lying. According to the police officers, she gave evasive answers, was confused in her statements, and sometimes her body language clearly indicated deceit. Despite this, the woman continued to insist that she was not involved in the incident and had no idea about the circumstances of the murder. Since Tracy refused to confess, the investigators had no way to charge her. They had no evidence, so Tracy was simply released from the station. The crime scene was thoroughly examined, as was the storm drain, but a fire crew had already washed away most of the traces when extinguishing the fire. The only valuable clue was the tire tracks, which the police officers believed were identical to the treads of a Penske van that Tracy had rented for her ex. During the inspection of the storm drain, small footprints and fabric fibers similar to the materials David's body had been wrapped in were found. It appeared as if the murderer had tried to stuff the body into the drain but failed. Most witnesses described Tracy as a quarrelsome and aggressive woman. The reports about her were overwhelmingly negative, but that obviously wasn't enough to arrest and charge her. The police began checking video recordings from around the victim's residence. On the same day, a young woman who looked very similar to Tracy was filmed in front of a store near the house. Although the footage was blurry, the investigators were able to reconstruct the sequence of events using the video material. After reviewing dozens of hours of footage, the investigators found the same distinctive yellow Penske van that looked like a rental vehicle, which had also stopped near the victim's house. The van was later traced back to the driveway of the house. The next footage showed that 3 days after David's murder, someone parked a white Lexus, which resembled Tracy's car, in the parking lot. The footage again showed a woman walking along the front of the store, buying something, and then leaving. The employees of the Tom Thumb store revealed that she had bought cleaning supplies in large quantities, which looked very suspicious. The investigators recognized Tracy as the woman in the video and began communicating more persistently with her. Nevertheless, she continued to claim that she had nothing to do with the murder, and that all the documents found by the police were forged to frame her and close the case quickly. As an alibi, Tracy claimed that she was with her parents in Arlington during that time. However, it was impossible to find witnesses to confirm her presence in another city since her family had been out of town. The police officers needed more information to file charges. It was decided to obtain a search warrant for the primary suspect's home. According to the investigators, Tracy killed David in his sleep with a shot to the heart, which took place in the victim's home. The medical examiners believed that David didn't even have time to feel anything while he slept. It turned out that Tracy purchased a new mattress immediately after David's death, which confirmed the investigators' suspicions. It also seemed suspicious that the house was full of cleaning products, similar to those on the shopping list from the hardware store where Tracy had allegedly bought them. In the event of the man's death, Tracy stood to gain a tangible financial benefit in the form of the house. According to Donna, the house was the only reason for the murder. Tracy insisted that David's death would not bring her any income. She argued that she deserved David's house to be transferred to her. She claimed that there were no insurance policies on David in which she could have been a beneficiary, and since she was not formally married to the man, she could not make any other claims. It was suspected that the motive might not only be a financial issue, but also revenge for a broken relationship. Investigators believed that after the murder, Tracy used the yellow Penske van that she had allegedly rented to help David move. It was likely that this had been planned from the beginning to mislead the investigation. The detectives thought that the murderer used the van to transport the body, strapping the deceased to a dolly with belts, then drove to the location of the new house David wanted to move into. Here, fibers were found that suggested Tracy tried to dispose of David by dumping the body in a storm drain, but she obviously failed. She likely left him on the property and returned 2 days later to finish what she had started. During this time, she was recorded several times on surveillance cameras. She apparently decided to destroy the evidence by burning the body in a fire. Tracy likely wanted to ensure that David's remains would burn to ashes, wrapping the body in multiple layers of tarps and electric blankets. Unfortunately for the killer, a passing driver noticed the fire and called the fire department. If Tracy's plan had succeeded and no one had noticed the fire, she could have disposed of the charred remains in a sewer. Due to a mishap, this was not possible. The day after a second visit to the police station, the woman was arrested and charged with the murder of David Nixon. During an initial hearing, the judge released the accused on bail. She was equipped with an electronic tracking device that allowed her to move around freely until the hearing on the murder charges. Although all of David's friends and acquaintances were convinced of his ex-girlfriend's guilt, she had many defenders. The most committed of them was Roland Taylor. The man was a local dentist and a neighbor of the couple. He was born in the United Kingdom, but later moved to Texas and settled there. Roland and Tracy had been friends for a long time. He had already heard some accusations against the woman, but was sure that Tracy was the exact opposite of what the critics described. The man remained convinced that David had many enemies due to his gambling debts who might have wanted to kill him. David not only owed money to many people, but it seemed that he had no intention of stopping. The deceased spent enormous sums in casinos and on escorts. Against this background, it was, of course, worthwhile to look for other potential suspects who had a motive. Upon investigation, however, it was found that the deceased had no debts. Sometimes he borrowed sums, lost them in the casino, and then paid off his creditors promptly. Therefore, this version proved to be unsustainable. The active stance of the defense led to speculation that the pair had an affair after Tracy was released on bail. Later, Roland and Tracy got engaged. The man was ready to do anything to defend the justice and freedom of the woman he loved. He helped her find a decent lawyer, and with his help, Tracy hired an attorney in 2005. He turned out to be an experienced criminal defense attorney, although he had only handled 3 murder cases. Nonetheless, he was confident that the prosecutors only had circumstantial evidence and that it would be easy for him to secure an acquittal for his client. In the attorney's opinion, she was arrested within the first 36 hours of the investigation, which was too short a time to thoroughly examine all potential suspects in the case and adequately assess their likely involvement. Only a criminal caught red-handed at the crime scene, for instance, with a weapon in hand, could be arrested so quickly. That was not the case here. Normally, investigators need more time to check and narrow down possible suspects. The defense attorney saw this as a clear attempt to close the case as quickly as possible and place the responsibility for the crime on the first suspect they could find. Moreover, according to him, the prosecution had no direct evidence of her involvement in the murder. No traces of Tracy's DNA or fingerprints were found either in the house or in the van. No murder weapon, presumably a pistol, was found either. The prosecution relied on the statements of some of the people questioned, who were convinced of Tracy's guilt from the outset due to their conflicts with the deceased. Their relationship had been so turbulent that David had obtained a restraining order against his ex shortly before his death, and they had no contact with each other, even though they lived in the same house. Against this background, her story about David asking her for help with the move sounded strange. People close to him said that the man tried to avoid his ex more. The lawyer knew that the police had a video of his client's interrogation and requested a copy. After reviewing the material, the defense attorney was convinced that the police had used one of their interrogation techniques to put pressure on the suspect and get the answers they wanted. The defense insisted that everything had been planned from the start to make Tracy look bad. One of the prosecutor's strongest pieces of evidence was the surveillance footage showing Tracy leaving her white Lexus, getting into a rented van, and then shopping for cleaning supplies at a store near the crime scene. After speaking with the store's employees, it was possible to obtain the receipts for the purchases made by the woman captured on the footage. The shopper used a loyalty card to get a discount, and the card was registered in the suspect's name, saving her 19 cents. Tracy claimed that she couldn't remember the existence of such a card and emphasized that under no circumstances would she leave such a trail if she intended to move unnoticed through the city. The woman was convinced that she was being framed. The investigators matched the cleaning supplies found during the house search and were confident that these items were the same ones purchased at the hardware store. The defense lawyer presented several theories that could explain David's death. It was speculated that he might have been the victim of a robbery, or that the attack could have been a carefully planned act of revenge, targeting the gambling-addicted realtor because of his debts. In the lawyer's opinion, other potential killers were more suitable suspects than Tracy. The defense believed that Jerry Vauville, a longtime friend of David's, could be involved in the case. They had vacationed together at the lake house, and he was a frequent visitor to their home and knew Tracy well. According to the woman, Jerry had borrowed money from David and didn't want to pay it back, which could be a motive for murder. The police decided to investigate the man. Jerry immediately understood Tracy's attempt to shift the blame onto him since he was an easy target due to his close relationship with the victim. He admitted that he had occasionally borrowed money from David, but he refused to admit any involvement in the case. According to the man, Jerry was in the business of selling used cars. 2 months before the tragedy, he needed money and asked his friend David for a large sum, which David didn't refuse. After Christmas, however, Jerry repaid the entire amount. Jerry and David had planned to meet on the night of his disappearance. According to Jerry, David wanted to buy a new boat. Jerry confessed that they were supposed to go out for a drink that day to celebrate the long-awaited purchase. The last time he heard David's voice was on the morning of the day he disappeared, when the friend spoke on the phone and set a time to meet. Unfortunately, David never showed up and didn't answer his phone again. It wasn't until later that his friend realized what had really happened. The lawyer knew from Tracy that David had planned to bring $25,000 in cash that day to meet his friend because he was ready to buy the boat on the spot. Jerry insisted that he hadn't seen David that day and that there were no further debts between them, so he had no motive to commit the crime. After this lid didn't pan out, Tracy pointed to another possible killer who turned out to be the victim's first wife, Donna. Just 2 months before his death, David took out an insurance policy worth $500,000 and named his son as the primary beneficiary, with Donna as the secondary beneficiary, since the boy was still too young at that time. The deceased's ex-wife received the payout for his death. Tracy herself was not mentioned in any of these policies, which suggested that Donna benefited from her ex-husband's death. Nonetheless, Donna received a very modest sum after his death, about $50,000, to take care of their son. She considered it absurd to call this a motive for such a brutal crime, since David would have paid her more in child support every month while he was alive. The deceased's son, Nicholas, also insisted from the beginning that only Tracy could have killed his father. He had repeatedly witnessed their rather violent arguments and was certain that it was always Tracy who provoked them. The defense attorney continued to argue that the prosecution had no real evidence against Tracy and that the police hadn't seriously investigated the possible involvement of other people. More than 3 years had passed since David's murder, and now Tracy was finally going to stand trial. Along with her lawyer, she was confident, as they didn't take the prosecution's arguments seriously. The prosecution, on the other hand, believed there could be no doubt about Tracy's involvement. She was an unstable and aggressive woman who didn't even need a motive to kill someone. However, a motive in the form of a house was a compelling argument, as the man could challenge the reinstatement of the house in Tracy's name and reclaim the property. Dentist Roland Taylor, the accused's fiancé, continued to insist that the court was wrong and was about to prosecute the wrong person. He was convinced of her innocence and believed that the loyalty card with Tracy's name had been deliberately stolen to incriminate her. The defense attorney continued to argue that the prosecution had no forensic evidence. There were no witnesses, and the murder weapon had not yet been found. The defense lawyer was confident that the case file would not even be sufficient to substantiate the charges. Tracy believed that the incident was a calculated revenge scheme and insisted that she was being wrongfully accused and that the real culprit would never be found. In her opinion, the investigators simply did not dig deep enough into the case. But the prosecutor also had valuable information. According to the deceased's son, Nicholas, his father kept a gun in a safe in the bedroom of the house where the man lived with Tracy. The investigators were never able to locate the weapon to conduct a ballistic test. The son believed that the suspect had access to the safe used the gun, and then disposed of it. Tracy, however, maintained that David never kept a weapon on the premises, at least none that she had seen. At the same time, she could not explain why she had bought a new mattress right after her ex's death. The reason seemed quite obvious. The old mattress had become a crime scene that couldn't be cleaned of blood anymore. The prosecution's arguments were supported by witnesses, particularly the store employees, who identified Tracy as the woman who had visited the store that day and purchased a large quantity of cleaning supplies, which could have been used to clean up blood. She even asked the staff in the household chemicals department what would effectively remove bloodstains from a carpet. They recommended hydrochloric acid, which was unavailable, so they suggested ordering the product online. She bought other items as well. During a subsequent search, all the purchased items were found in the house where Tracy lived. The prosecution argued that this allowed the pieces of the puzzle to come together into a coherent whole. The defense made another attempt to portray Donna as the likely murderer, arguing that she had a strong motive. However, Nicholas's mother received too little, only $50,000, to seriously consider committing such a crime. They also tried to pin the blame on David's second wife, Lisa, as a possible suspect. A thorough investigation was conducted to see if Donna and Lisa were involved in the murder. Phone data and geographic movements were analyzed. Ultimately, they could not be connected to the crime in any way. Additionally, Donna and Lisa had good relationships with their ex-husband, which was confirmed by many people, and they both had solid alibis. Lisa seemed to have no motive for the murder whatsoever. At the end of the hearing, Tracy felt less confident. She stated, "I don't believe in justice anymore. I don't know how I will feel afterward." The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury found the ex-wife of the deceased guilty. The decision was reached in less than 4 hours, and the woman was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The outcome completely satisfied the victim's family, and most breathed a sigh of relief, except for Roland Taylor. He remained loyal to his fiancée, continued to insist on her innocence, and visited her in prison. Tracy, with his help, filed an appeal, which was ultimately rejected. She will be eligible for parole in 2024, at which point she will be 55 years old. Roland still visits Tracy every weekend in prison. Thank you for watching, and take care.